Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. Once again, welcome to MNE-202, Secure Design Principles. We're very excited about this course. We have some returning instructors, Mr. Sean Nelson, a solutions engineer under the AV team. We have with us Scott Patterson, our manager of solutions engineering, part of our sales support services team. And I am your co-host, Richard Sasson, our global technical services. We have a wonderful support team with us on the back end to help answer some questions as well. We are so glad that you could all join us today, and we hope you are all being safe and healthy. We want to do something a little bit different today before we get started. We're actually going to start with a poll. And we'd actually like to know, have you worked with a customer that has a dedicated IT security staff, not a dedicated IT staff, but specifically a dedicated security staff as part of their IT department? So take a look at the poll, not enough coffee yet, and let's get your feedback and see what you're going to tell us, because we're going to be talking a lot about designing for secure locations and secure systems, and a lot of different information, a lot of resources we will share and discuss throughout. This again is a overall design class for the environment, and a lot of questions that you want to ask as designers when speaking with your customers and your end users to be able to create a secure system for their use. I do see lots of people are voting, which is great. I also see a lot of people still coming into the class. So wonderful to see you all here. Thank you for all the great good mornings. And we are going to be talking about government work. We'll be talking about corporate work, financial work, and secure environments in general. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and wrap up the poll. And we're going to share the results and get started here with that. And I'm going to turn it over to Sean Nelson and Scott Patterson. But gentlemen, here are the results. And you can see that our customers have been working with companies that have dedicated IT security staff. So I think that'll help frame a lot of the statements you're going to make. This is a group that has been dealing with security. They understand some of it. And I'm sure they're going to have lots of questions as to how they can be best suited to answer those questions, where that information can be found, and how they can be successful. So, gentlemen, I turn it over to you. Scott and Sean, take it away.
All right,
Thank you, Rich. Thank you. It's good to see that a lot of people have actually worked with security staff. That was one of my bigger questions, primarily because of the fact that it's a completely different conversation when you're working with security. They are a lot quieter. They're a lot more reserved. They don't openly offer information, and sometimes that can be challenging for our dealers. So overall objectives here, just kind of clicking through them. We are designing systems for secure locations. Scott, I believe you've got, yep, there you go. A lot of things we're doing is going to be market specific. We are going to talk a lot about military, because military tends to be the tightest of the markets. And then from military, we can then start to kind of trickle down, talk a little bit about corporate, some of the other markets that are out there as well. Just lots and lots of good information on this. A big conversation is actually the interview process itself, because of the fact that there is so much limited information available at any given time. There's a specific process, if you will, just trying to get information from them. Once you have the information from them, then at that point, you really have to start putting other things together. You have to kind of start looking at the scope of work a little bit. You kind of have to end up looking at the BOM a little bit as well. And in reviewing the scope of work, a lot of that conversation really kind of boils down to looking for some keywords that are going to direct you as to what you want to do for that bill of materials. I did say the word BOM, unfortunately. It's referred to as a bill of materials. Scope of work is SOW as well. So kind of developing everything, and then at that point, we'll give you guys a couple of examples, kind of show a couple of things that we've kind of put together. We did strip all the information off of it because these are quotes that individuals have worked with us from a design perspective as well. And we'll probably kind of wrap this thing up with an open discussion as well. So we'll have an open discussion kind of at the end of it. So, all right. So, wanted to kind of present this to you guys as something to kind of consider and think about, and some of the security challenges that you encounter. I mentioned that military is quite honestly, really at the top of that list. It's the very first one you're going to run into. Military tends to be very strict. One of the complications is that they have an overall policy that you obviously have. They then have a policy for that specific military branch. And then they actually have policies in some cases for individual commands as well. And trying to fit within all of that can be incredibly challenging. None of it's conflicting. A lot of times what it is it gets stricter as it trickles downwards. So as you get all the way down to the individual command level, they may take a very conservative approach to what was previously a little bit more open of a specification. So that definitely does become a big conversation piece. One of the bigger things for us is the fact that we are JITC certified, and JITC does allow us stateside to get into a lot of applications that are military based. We're on what's known as the approved product list, or APL, and JITC is the basically it's the testing command, Joint Interoperability Test Command. They test all the electronics that are going to go on to any type of a military network or any kind of a military installation. So they literally just take a box, fire away at it, and then they give you the report. And it can take 6 months to a year to get that information back. It's definitely a very time-consuming process.
Hey,
In addition to, go ahead.
Sean, you got a good story about being in a secure environment?
I've got plenty of stories about being in a secure environment. I know, Rich, you had rattled one off, and I started laughing because I knew exactly who was involved. We had individuals that were on a secure location. They had essentially walked in. They were told not only what location to go to, and were actually escorted to that location, they were actually told what individual Ethernet ports to plug their laptops into. So they were hooking everything up. They were getting everything together. One of the guys was not really paying attention. He was actually busy talking to the other one, went and plugged into a port without really paying attention to it. And you immediately heard the click, and that click was actually the magnetic door lock for the door itself. Within moments, pretty much, they ended up with 2 armed guards and a very upset IT guy. They had literally plugged into the wrong port. Now, the one that I had encountered, I was actually on the phone as some of this was transpiring. They were able to explain what happened, et cetera, et cetera. They were able to stay. Another one that Rich encountered, they were actually escorted off the site. Because of the security policy of that site, they were not allowed to stay because they had essentially breached security.
Well,
it
actually,
is
Sean,
very serious.
just to clarify, Sean, by escorted off the site, they were escorted off the site with 2 armed guards with M16 because he plugged into the correct port in this case, but the port had been patched incorrectly. So
geez.
that was the real issue. He had plugged into the correct port, and he walked in, and when the guard came in with the M15 aimed at him, he literally said, "I'm plugged into the orange port. I'm in the orange port. I'm in the orange port." And they picked him up and they escorted him out. The computer stayed, his bag stayed. Nothing was allowed to leave.
Yeah.
So it was a very, very interesting scenario. So security really is an important component.
Yeah.
And there's a couple of questions here that came up already. Do you find that the financial sector is second to the military for security concerns? In some cases, they may be as equal to or as concerned. They just have a different approach to how they get things approved.
I find that the financial sector a lot of times is air gapped. So a lot of times they'll be completely separate. They also generally don't notate on the original scope of work what security protocols or policies they have in place. You tend to run into the financial sector as you're going through your project, and that's definitely frustrating. Military tends to be very forthcoming, very upfront. They'll say, this is what we need. This is what is going to allow you to be on X network or in X location, essentially. So it's a different approach. It's the same level of security. And you could, argue apples and oranges as to which one's more effective, but it's a different approach to it is really what it is. The other one I'd bring up, actually, if you want to go ahead and click real quick, isn't so much that. It's you trickle down from military to government, and that's where it gets interesting. Because government, suddenly you could be dealing at a federal level, you could be dealing at a state level, you could be dealing at a county level, and all 3 of them tend to have their own policies. They have their own way, essentially, of doing things. And I've come across unique approaches county to county. I've come across unique approaches state to state. Federal does have standards, but I've come across different interpretations based upon whether you're talking something like district courts or some of the other offices that are federal based, and also which IT staff you're talking to. Sometimes the IT director does have an impact on how they implement the policy within that facility. So it's definitely a conversation. You had mentioned banking, and financial is one of them. Pharmaceuticals, actually, they tend to have a lot of security, primarily because of development and R&D. Casinos, I know a lot of people on here have probably heard about the casino that ended up getting hacked because they had an aquarium temperature sensor that was on the open network. I know there was a big brief, what was it, 2 years ago, I think, maybe a little bit more, where they were talking about how that one temperature sensor, that Internet of Things, exposed their network to a whole lot more. And obviously the tech sector. Tech sector is always going to be one of those that you really have to kind of be careful with, because they have a lot of policies in place. Education, you actually kind of fall into two categories. You do have the category that's forward-facing, faculty, students, etc., trying to keep people off a network. That's fairly basic security and a bit of a cat and mouse game. But then you go to the other side of the core, or of the collegiate area, the education area. And in particular, you get into the research facilities. Those research facilities, in a lot of instances, they're doing some of the relationships with things like government, with things like financial and pharma and whatnot. So that's definitely something to be aware of. But I mean, overall, what it really boils down to is how do you meet these challenges? How do you address them, overcome them to a certain degree? And more importantly, how does it impact your overall design? I've seen a lot of situations, even here within tech sales on the design end, where the IT guy can throw a red flag on the field, and that just brings everything to an absolute screeching halt. So it's something you have to be aware of. If anything, I've said more than once, talk to the IT guy as soon as you can, make sure they're in the meeting, make sure they're aware of what's going on, and that kind of plays into what we're going to get into. I'm seeing all kinds of things pop up in the chat, from nuclear power plants to medical. You run into stuff everywhere. You honestly run into stuff everywhere. So, and that leads to this. This is kind of where we're going with this. From an interview perspective, who's in charge of that security policy? More importantly than who's in charge of the security policy, do you have access to them? Because a lot of times who you're sitting down at the table with may not have any bearing whatsoever on the IT team. They may not be invited to the party. I hate saying this, but IT tends to be the last one notified and the first one to object. That's kind of what I've run into a few times. So if they are responsible for it, this is where things get a little more interesting. Have you run into teams that only cover the secure locations? So then you end up with an IT team that's specifically in charge of security policy and security. You have your general IT team that's in charge of everywhere else. They may or may not communicate with each other. So sorting out who's responsible for what on an overall facility and being able to implement your solution certainly becomes a communication nightmare. And that leads to who's reviewing it. You know, do I run it through both of them? Do I run it through one? Do I run it through the other? Who do I run this through? And you'll notice I keep throwing you guys more and more questions, right? You know, do they have the authority to sign off on this? If they're sign off, are they sign off for only the secure site? Are they sign off for the non-secure? Are they sign off for both? Is this one signature in a series of signatures that I need? How are the dominoes going to fall, right? At the end of the day, from an interview standpoint, as much as I like gathering up all these different names, I've been on conversations where there's lots of names, lots of titles, lots of ranks. You're sitting there with a notepad trying to figure out who's who. End of the day, who is my point of contact? Who can I work directly with? And then as my network grows and I know who's responsible for it, I can address those issues as they come up. But to start with, I kind of need a single point of contact. It does get overwhelming. Rich, the reason I'd asked that question at the very beginning, and I'm kind of curious, we didn't make it into a poll, but I'm kind of curious if people have run into this where it is very overwhelming the first couple of times you try to work with a security team. because of the barrage of questions, because of the barrage of things that they're kind of throwing at you. Why are you here and what are you doing? And that's kind of the foundation of security. Why are you here? What are you doing? That's kind of what they do.
Well, you know, Sean, it's a good talking point, because one of the things that you are discussing here is your interview process, right? And what is important to understand is, who are you going to be interacting with on the project overall? What are their requirements? Okay. And you have to start to go and start asking yourself all sorts of questions. Do my products have to be MAC address identified? So if you're putting a network device on their network, do I have to provide a list of MAC addresses and serial numbers to them? What other information do I need to provide to the security team at a facility about the product? So having JITC certification is always a great remover of barriers, right?
Yeah.
And so that's how you can set those things up at front, okay? Then also ensuring that you are following the secure best practices, which I know you're going to discuss further on, as we've outlined on our website at security.crestron.com. You also have the ability to see all that stuff and prepare for that. But this all is part of what you're talking about here, the interview process. What are the requirements for your customer? How does my system need to live on the network and be secure? What do I need to implement? SSH, SSL, what are you using? Not to really SSL so much anymore, but you know, what are you using for your security protocols in the environment, right? And so there's a lot of things to discuss those things. And the nice thing is that when products ship from Crestron, the shipping information now pre-populates with the MAC addresses and serial numbers, so that our customers can take that information and already present it to the IT security department at the facility that they're installing their gear, saying, here's what we're going to install, and be proactive about it. So that this way they're not surprised and they're not blocked by MAC addresses. Okay. Now, it is important that you work with the company InfoSec team. Everyone is different. And so it is a bit of a challenge. And so I'm going to let it go back to you, because I've gotten on my soapbox a bit.
No, that's not a bad thing, Rich. It's not. I mean, we've all run into this. It's honestly is. I was looking at some of the chats, kind of scrolling past as you were talking as well, and people are kind of saying the same thing that I was thinking, which is you really need to get those MAC addresses in some sort of an Excel sheet, so that it's already right there. There at some point, I guarantee MAC filtering is one of the basic security policies. It's very basic, very simple. You're allowed to be on this based on this list. And yes, you can certainly spoof a MAC address, but it gets out at least quite a bit of stuff. So having all those MACs, that's step one. I've run into situations where they gave everyone's MAC address for all their techs. They gave all the MAC addresses for all the boxes, etc., and they forgot to provide the information for the CSP. So the programmer shows up on site or tries to do their thing, and suddenly they can't get on the network to do their stuff, even though the technician next to them can. In a couple of instances, what they ended up doing is handing off thumb drives. It was faster for them because they were just right there to not even bother with it. It was just a quick update for them to do it that way. But in a lot of situations, you need to clear everything through IT, and that takes time. And that leads to another statement, which is whether or not you give any kind of, I'll get into the justification question in a minute, but it leads to another statement where you kind of get into this situation where should I give them some sort of a demo, some sort of a salesman sample? You know, a lot of times when you're talking security, you can get to a situation where they need to see things ahead of time. And so you give them, say, 2 or 3 NVXs, they set it up, they go back and forth, they try and do that real quick. And then at that point, you end up being able to say, yes, this solution's going to work. We're going to deploy this on a larger scale. From a conversation standpoint, to kind of steer this back a little ways from an interview, one of the biggest challenges I run into is that people ask questions without having a reason to ask them. And that's the single fastest way to get a security team to shut you down. I've seen sales guys say something they shouldn't and get an interview shut down. I've seen any number of individuals that are there say something and get an entire meeting shut down. At the end of the day, you really need a process where you are saying, this is what I would like to do. This is the solution I'm presenting. I need justification to do X. Can I do this? And then let them decide. I've had examples with NVX where I've tried to explain, we are trying to just deploy audio and video on a multicast environment. We would like to do this on its own separate VLAN. Here's what NVX requires. Are you able to support this? And then I can provide them with the appropriate documentation, let them vet it. If I were to go the other direction and just walk in and say, hey, so what's on your network, and do you guys have this, this, and this, I would drop so many red flags, I'd be kicked out of the meeting.
Hey, Sean.
It's all a matter of approach.
So talking about that a little bit more, I mean, the language of talking to IT people is quite important, because you can actually, you know, coming from their point of view, you know, their whole life is about keeping a secure environment, keeping their network secure. And when you ask them what's on your network, that's really asking them, you know, give me all your security secrets, you know? So
Yeah.
that really shuts down a conversation quite quickly.
It does. I noticed on the light up, some people were saying, well, USB is not allowed with DoD. And yeah, the DoD does not like USB at all. They don't like a lot of different medias. There's a lot of times where even burning a media, if you burn a media and hand it off, it stays in the room that it was in and it's then destroyed, which is why they like doing it on disk in most cases. But end of the day, they had to do a handoff of some sort. I don't remember if it was USB or not. I think it was USB, and I don't think it was military related, but yeah, it's interesting. It always is. On top of justification, which is one of those fun conversations to have, you also run into the issue of not being given all the information. You know, above just the comment about it being compartmentalized. You don't necessarily, as a designer, need to know what every source is per se. You do need to know how it interacts with your system, both on an input and an output conversation, as well as how many of them there are. And to really drive this home, I had to recover, because a sales guy literally said, and I quote, hey, there's a bunch of sources here that are just labeled secret. What are you doing? And I cringed and very politely said, gentlemen, all I need to know is which version of HDMI it is, and how you plan to interact, and what you need to hand off on the other end. Am I handing off to a 4-input video wall? Am I handing off to a couple of different locations? That's all I need. And then afterwards, I had a conversation with our sales rep to explain. And I say it was not our guy, it was someone else. But I had a conversation with the sales rep afterwards, specifically because I had to explain this was a secure environment. And some of those sources were sources that were classified appropriately that we had no business knowing what they were. We're simply delivering from point A to point B. So.
Hey, Sean, what about like sign-offs and stuff? Do we get any, have you come across any, you know, plans that were given to us that we'd have to sign off on because they're secure documents?
I've had situations where they needed to vet us just to be able to see what proposal they wanted to do. Where just getting to that scope of work, just getting to that bill of materials, and it feels weird saying bill of materials instead of BOM. I'm used to saying scope and BOM. Just getting to the documentation was a challenge. So you certainly do encounter that. A lot of those situations, though, they're usually closed bids. They're usually very specific individuals that are already have that working relationship with that particular entity. And so in that instance, a lot of times they're contacting you and saying, here's what we need to have it cleared. And Rich, to your point, this is kind of where CSPs come in, because you can get CSPs that are specialized for programming in those environments, that have the appropriate certifications for those environments. And really it becomes that specialty for them that you can hire somebody who's either pre-approved by the entity or somebody the entity already runs in those circles with, which makes it a little bit easier as well.
By the way, Sean, let's explain what a CSP is, which is a Crestron service provider. They are not dealers, but people who actually configure, program. They're highly skilled, certified programmers who offer services to do exactly what you just discussed and then some.
Apologies, I didn't get my water as quickly as I thought I was going to.
No problem, Sean.
I tried, Rich. I thought you were going longer.
Sorry, usually I do.
All right. So go ahead, Scott, if you want to proceed on this. All right. Source management's another conversation to have. And the main reason for source management being a bit of an issue, especially in secure environments, is because not all sources are necessarily present. You run into a lot of situations where those sources end up being in secure vaults. They end up being in other rooms, other locations behind multiple doors and armed guards. You never know essentially where that source is going to be located at and how you're going to wire to and from that source, which then brings infrastructure into question, because you need to understand whether it's going to be copper, whether it's going to be fiber. A lot of times now they are moving to a network solution. We're seeing more and more adoption of that, and part of that adoption, believe it or not, is because of things like JITC, because you do have the certification and the security now to be able to say, yes, I can play on this network if I have to. And here's kind of where, from a design standpoint, we tend to stray a little bit from just the marketing. The marketing is, hey, we've got JITC, this is awesome, and it is. The reality for a lot of secure environments is we have the certification to be present at that facility, to be on that network, but we prefer to have an isolated network. Now, whether you want to do a VLAN scenario where you're just doing its own little offshoot on a subnet, that's one way to do it, or whether you want a physical air gap solution that is not touching a network whatsoever, that is also a viable solution. It does impact your design. Both of them have impacts. They have pros and cons related to them, but it's a conversation to be had. It certainly is. And at the end of the day, the biggest question I always have, and I've had several, I'm not mentioning any names whatsoever, I always am very careful about this. I've had several scenarios where you go through the motion, you design everything, you lay everything out, and then you find out that not only are you not necessarily going on site, but they're assembling it somewhere else. You did all the development of it, but they're turning boxes elsewhere. That tends to be nerve-wracking, and a lot of times, and I'm kind of curious if people on here do this or not, a lot of times I recommend trying to stage equipment as much as possible, especially when it's secure environment stuff, to try and stage what you can to verify and validate that it works, especially if you're going to be packing it up, shipping it, and someone else, military personnel, for example, are going to be assembling it on their end. So that's a bit of a challenge. And then the other half that I've also dealt with is you go through everything and you do have to go on site. And assuming you have to go on site, that becomes a conversation. If I have to make an on site, what clearances do I need? Who's my point of contact when I show up at the facility? All that fun stuff. Now with the pandemic and COVID-19, that becomes even more critical, because what was already a limited access job site becomes an even more restricted job site because they're restricting the amount of personnel. I've seen a lot of dealers, and I've spoken to a lot of dealers, that previously they could have 10, 15 plus guys on there. Now they're limited to 4. And that's a significant challenge. So the argument is staging as much as you can ahead of time. There's only been 3 times that I'm aware of that I've run across a situation where they were not allowed to open the box due to the environment it was going to be in. It had to be sealed by the manufacturer. It had to be appropriately signed and documented. It was a couple of unique job sites. Those are the toughest ones, but most of them, they allow you to pre-stage if you're able to. And the honest thing is that IT is going to go through it anyways. They're going to look through all that anyways. I know some of this seems a little bit basic. I'm kind of going over all of it because, you know, some people have encountered this, some people haven't. The hope is that we kind of give you guys a bit of a nugget here and there on different things. So some of the key things that you really want to look for, especially when you're going through the scope of work, because the scope has all kinds of great stuff in it. I know everyone focuses on the classifications. They go nuts. They go, oh, this is classified, this is secure. At the end of the day, it's a grouping of sources. That's really all it is. It's, we're going to group these sources in this, we're going to group these sources in that. That's really what it is at the end of the day, right? But the question is, how do I group them? How do I set them aside? Are they all set in a single rack? Are they set in multiple racks? What is the policy that they have regarding those security requirements? How are they laying it out, right? What goes to what room? When is it presentable to what room? All that stuff's a lot of times in the scope of work. A lot of times what they'll do towards the tail end of all this, they'll put everything in the front. Here's what I want to do. Here's a summary. That's great. But at the tail end of it, they'll say, by the way, here's all the white papers I need. I need all this information. When I say white papers, really what it is it's engineering documentation. It's explanations of specific questions they might have. And this is what I politely refer to as round one. Because you answer those questions, a lot of times there's additional questions that'll come up. And we'll get to that in a few. We're actually going to talk about that as well. But the white papers at least start that. Paying attention to the required infrastructure. I did say hardware and infrastructure. There are times where they dictate very specific things. They say that I'm going to use this specific make model of display. And there may be specific things that they want in that, right? They could say, for example, I want to use the NVX 350 and I want it for these specific reasons, the scalar or the HDMI loop out, those tend to be the popular reasons. Any number of things, CP3 and CP3 ends, CP3 in particular, not so much the ends. CP3 tends to be very, very popular for a variety of reasons, right? But at the end of the day, they want to make sure that they have the hardware they need or at least suggest to use. You still have to kind of double check things. And from an infrastructure standpoint, is it copper? Is it fiber? Are they allowing wireless? Most times, and I'm guessing the chat's going to blow up here in a moment, most times wireless is not allowed in a secure environment. If it is allowed, it's heavily locked down. There are different terminologies when I say wireless, whether you're talking the Zigbee mesh networks, whether you're talking the actual wireless for Wi-Fi type access, you know, panels, etc. But at the end of the day, do they even allow that? I've run into a lot of situations where RF in general is not allowed. They specifically say we want either copper or fiber, and they do allow IR, but the problem with IR is you don't get feedback. So it's a lot of different things that you have to be kind of aware of, so to speak, as you're looking through everything. Yep. The equipment location itself. If I could real quick, I saw somebody toss this on here that said try working on a Navy vessel. I was former Marine Corps. One of the other bigger challenges, Rich, that's not even on here is environmental. If you are anywhere near any of the radio communications, if you're anywhere near some of the higher power stuff, that plays absolute havoc with certain equipment. I'm just going to throw that out here right now. That's specific to the military. But yes, it's definitely a challenging one, right? So that kind of falls in equipment location. That's not the direction I was intending. The complication with equipment location, as I noted earlier, is if you don't know exactly where it is, then it becomes an issue of I might have to do a fiber run. I might be outside of that 100 meters, for example. So lots of good stuff here.
You know, Sean, there's a lot going on in the chat that I've been watching a little bit because we're going to answer questions and answers. But you know, this is a very broad subject, right? And really, what we want the group to understand is this is helping to create a path to understanding all the requirements, okay, for the project. Every project is going to differ. Okay, and if you're using wireless and you get approval for, let's say, 802.1x with Wi-Fi, what solutions work that? Okay, now if you're looking at like our Infinite EX solution, those are fully encrypted,
Yep.
you know, 128 bit AES encryption. So it's a fully secure environment. So it really becomes a matter of understanding what technology fits into which scenario, you know, and again, different groupings require different products, and
Right.
it is understanding all those things. We have, you know, the JITC, which is the JITC certification, which is a U.S. government, U.S. military specification. Okay,
Right.
and that's an important one, which we talked about. And the JITC is the Joint Interoperability Test and Command Approval. That's only one level of certification, but that's a really good certification to have. A lot of Crestron products are, as you said earlier, on the approved vendor list for the U.S. military. When you put those two things together, many companies, many secure environments accept that as a validated solution. Okay. Now, there are things that you also need to do, right? There's other certifications. There's Tempest, and there's way more that you can go into that discusses these things. Not every technology Crestron makes fits into every secure solution. So you, as the design community here, has to understand what are the requirements of the project, going back to what you were talking about earlier with the interview and asking the right questions without probing. Okay.
And that's
And
really
that's
an
a
art
key
form to be
thing.
able to do that. That's
Yeah.
an art form to be able to do that. In addition to that, what I would probably say, even if they say, hey, we're going to use wireless, which is a rarity depending upon what it is. I've had, somebody had mentioned financial. Believe it or not, financial is one of those where you have a lot of very important people in a boardroom who expect to be able to do things like they would do them on their iPad. And they expect to not have a bunch of wires on their table. That's actually, from a design perspective, one of the more frustrating aspects, because they try to limit security, but they're looking for a very specific look and feel, is kind of the way I refer to it as. Even if they allow for something like wireless, what are the restrictions in play, and do my products support that? So you have to be really, really careful, because I could say, yeah, I support 802.11, but what are the actual things that they have on that network, certificates, et cetera, that I need to be aware of as well? And even then, and like I said, it's certainly, it is challenging. What I will say is a lot of the government dealers, a lot of the individuals who kind of specialize in the secure market, they tend to go to what they call the bread and butter. They say, I always do a CP3 for this reason. I always do this for this reason. They have, just like any other industry, they do have boilerplates, and they don't tend to vary too far away from them, but it does become challenging depending upon who your client is. So it's something to really be aware of.
One of the things too, Sean, on the scope of work, a lot of times we'll find that it actually states that, it has to be JITC certified, things like that. Our touch panel, no camera, the NC version of the 1060, because they cannot allow any cameras.
I was going to say, click the slide real quick. You're going to see that pop up right now. Well, actually, it's underneath that one. Description, skip description. Right there, you're going to see budget constraints, et cetera, and then you're going to see what about that interface? Because that's the one thing people miss. I've watched people spec everything they want, and then the touchscreen they chose had a camera and mic.
Yeah.
And IT, which, let's be honest, it's a trust-driven relationship with IT. You earn their trust, you maintain their trust. They find out that that touchscreen has a mic and camera, and things go south very quickly. So that's one of the big ones for me, is that no camera option. So that's something to think about. I've seen a lot of situations where they've done DGE 100s because they wanted to do larger touchscreens that did not have a camera and mic. But absolutely. Sorry, go ahead, Scott. I didn't mean to overrun you. I'm sorry.
Nope, that's all right. Let's move into developing our bill of materials. This is where it comes down to when you're going through that scope of work and making sure that you're selecting the proper product, like you just said about the no camera and, different things. So that's a big thing too, copper or fiber.
And I'm actually seeing the chat kind of go up again, and they already said, if they find something off with one thing, they're going to start looking at everything else a lot harder. And that's expected. IT is always going to be taking a critical look. They're in charge of security. That's their job. One of the things we have to do is maintain that trusting relationship and be there to support and be there for them, and own up if there is something that we didn't realize. Hey, apologies, we have to redesign. I was not aware this had a mic and camera. Let me correct this. Let me correct course. Copper or fiber, yeah, that's a huge one. It's difficult because when you say copper or fiber, you have to go that step further. I've had specifications where for us, Cat 5, Cat 6, et cetera, isn't that bad. But for some individuals, they'll say this site requires Cat 7, and that requirement is well beyond us. They want to do it. That's awesome. We can play with that. We're okay. Fiber's another one where they might say we're doing multi-mode fiber. They might say we're doing single mode fiber. We have to pay very close attention depending upon what products we choose. With NVX, I've got the SFP ports. That allows me to open the door to a lot of things. With traditional DM transmitters and receivers, I need to be a little bit more careful. I need to select my products based on the infrastructure they have in play and the distances they plan on going. because ultimately the distance determines the cable in turn determines what you're going to be choosing for product. Yep. And we're right back to the wired or wireless conversation. Can you even do wireless? Wireless keypads, that tends to be the bane of my existence because they can't seem to get a CrestNet to that location. Can we do wireless for this one keypad in this one location with this one gateway? Or the other one, this individual wants to have remotes. These CEOs want to have remotes. Can we do these remotes? And Rich, that's where the encrypted aspect of Zigbee comes in. To be able to actually say, yes, I can do it. Here's the standards we have. Is that appropriate for the implementation that you guys want to do? AV over IP or traditional transmit receive, I'm seeing more adoption of AV over IP. And it's happened quickly. It happened very, very quickly. Once we got the appropriate documentation, the appropriate white papers, the appropriate certification, that's when people started to move more to an AV over IP solution. They needed to have a secure environment they could place these in, right? Traditional transmit receive is still very, very common. You do run into those locations that's all they want. That's Old Faithful. They've done it the whole time. Get me another traditional DM chassis with appropriate cards, transmitters, and receivers. Where that becomes challenging is when they start to upgrade to 4K and they want to do fiber. That's when you have a very honest conversation about whether or not they want to start looking at an AV over IP solution. So they're both viable options. It just depends on what the budget is and what their layout and infrastructure already is. Source and display locations. We've hammered this home. I really don't need to say it, but I will say two things. Number one, if they say video wall, do they have a video wall processor, or are they just tossing our boxes behind the display? Because that's a key point that most people miss. And then when you're talking this all the way through, everyone forgets about the monitors that are on analyst station desks, right? They forget about the monitors that are right there next to all the members of a council chamber in a state house, for example. And monitors are incredibly important because even though everyone forgets about it, a lot of times they don't want the monitor to be a local per se. They want the monitor to be reinforcement for whatever's currently being displayed. Sometimes they want the monitor to actually be full-fledged switching. Other times you can just DA out to the monitor based upon whatever the source is going to the main displays. But it's definitely a conversation. Scott, remember the judges that we used to run into in the courthouses?
Yeah, sure.
You didn't make the judge happy, you were in real trouble. You had to have a display and a monitor right there. And I can say this politely, we had a couple instances where it was an older judge who did not want to wear his glasses. And he wanted something that he could easily look at that everyone around him thought was just a computer monitor, but was actually the same thing they were looking. It was just in much greater detail for him. It was a larger display directly in front of him, right? And that's a preference thing, but yeah, it's also a selling point for the sales guy. The sales guy went nuts over that. He was very friendly with that judge. Yeah, he went nuts over that. I remember that one.
Yeah.
Right? USB switching, the card readers. I said CSC readers. I'm not going to go into what CSC means, but basically these are the virtual keyboard mouse, KVMs, if you will. All right. So the ability to have one set keyboard, mouse, card reader, etc., and switch it to multiple PCs. Now, I've had some commands where they actually have two sets of keyboard mouse because they do not want to cross-pollinate USB from one PC to another PC. Essentially, they were nervous about the requirements they have for not having secret and non-secret touch, SIPR and NIPR if you want to be technical, all right? So they had two sets. A lot of other locations, they have an actual KVM that is on the approved list. It's on the APL, and that does all their switching, and then we just take the USB and route it accordingly. We've done that. We've ourselves handled USB traffic back and forth. There's more to that, though, and that doesn't lend itself very well to a secure environment. So a lot of times I actually encourage the KVMs at this point because the KVMs are designed to be able to do that. So, big one here, fiber isolation or power sequencing. at the end of the day, what this is this is source management. This is how am I going to ensure that these sources are only presentable and only available based on specific room classifications.
Hey, Sean,
And this, yeah.
last year when we were at Masters, remember we were talking in Middle Atlantic about power sequencing, and we started getting into secured racks and things where they actually had, if you opened up the rack, there was a camera inside that would take your picture.
Yeah, that was fun.
Yeah.
For anyone who was at Masters last year, we had a lot of partners that were at Masters. I was already kind of laughing about that. We had a lot of partners at Masters. We had somebody who was showing off the newer racks that they had, the different sensors they had, and I felt kind of bad because I started asking a bunch of questions, and believe it or not, they jumped right in. They did a great job. They jumped right in. The fact that they had a sensor that if you pop the back panel off of the rack, it took your photo as you popped it off and continued to take your photo in certain increments. So it knew who had opened the rack. All kinds of little lights and this, that, and the other. But what caught them off guard, they started doing power sequencing and saying, I can power off individual banks, I can power off individual endpoints, and that's great. But my question was, what about doing some sort of an optical isolator? You do have third parties that have fiber isolation, and really what it is you're passing a fiber cable into this. It's then passed out on the other end to relay that information. When you essentially close your contact, it shuts that communication of fiber off, and it'd be the equivalent of cutting a fiber cable in half. They have no communication whatsoever. Recently, I've used a lot of fiber isolation, in particular on uplinks. That's usually what I'll do, is I'll do the uplink to the switch that's there that has all the NVX equipment. So whether you want to or not, you can't talk to any of that NVX equipment. I shut the entire segment of that network down. Essentially, that whole switch gets shut down. The concern I usually have when it comes to power isolating and power sequencing is that there's a boot down time and a boot up time. And if someone is rapidly going through classifications in a room, that's going to impact how quickly they can move up or down that chain. Specifically up. Down is not a problem. Turning, flipping the switch, turning it off, that's no big deal. Turning it back on, you have certain things you have to boot up. And the reason they choose to power sequence us is because we have a shorter boot up time than their source. But at the end of the day, it's still a boot up time of some sort. Yep. Here's another big conversation. Is everything on premises? Do they allow, or do they have anything off-prem? Do they allow anything off-prem? And you could take this in a couple different directions. You could take this from a source conversation, where the sources are located. And at the end of the day, I'll be honest, I really don't mind either way, as long as I know how it's interacting with my system. But where it becomes a bigger issue is command and control capabilities. If you want to do something like Fusion, for example, any kind of scheduling, can they do a cloud service, or are they going to require it be a Fusion server on premises? VC-4 becomes a conversation. If they want to do any kind of VC-4 based controls, that does need access to the outside every so many days to be able to check in for licensing, etc. If they want to be able to do XIO cloud, that's a given. That's definitely off-prem. A lot of companies have different policies in place depending upon how secure the location is. They may lock it down to say you're only allowed to do things on-prem. I've had situations where they isolated a network to a particular room and nothing you did could go outside that room. So it definitely is a conversation to have, something to be aware of. And these are all things you could read through the scope of work, see if they've even addressed it. Sometimes scope of works are so open that you're not even sure what essentially is there, and you end up having to ask. And Rich, this goes back to your comment about compartmentalizing and that nuance of gently asking a question, but justifying why you have to ask that question.
Correct. And I think some things that are important to understand is, with cloud solutions, what does that mean, right? And there is, there's the Crestron cloud, okay, which is based in several different countries depending on the application, Fusion or XIO, and where it's located. Okay, but there are also, can I create my own virtual cloud? Can I create my own secure Fusion cloud? And you can do that. You can create your own Fusion Cloud in your own environment, okay? We have customers that do that today. They stand it up. We can help them with that, and they can set up their own secure tenant. It's not a multi-tenant environment, but it is a Fusion Cloud. It is a cloud environment that they can stand up in their environment that they're comfortable with. And we and our support team are glad to help them with that. So that's not a problem if we want to do that. You know, Fusion Cloud is an Azure-based solution. Okay, you can install it in other cloud environments. If you want to put it in to AWS, you can. You would need to manage it, but we'll be more than glad to help that get set up. You know, there are certain things like XIO, for example, is not available for Department of Defense implementation, but Fusion can be installed in a DoD cloud by the customer. And again, they're responsible for managing it, but we'll be glad to help them get that done. You know, and I know a lot of people are asking all sorts of questions about GDPR. Well, XIO Cloud and Fusion are GDPR compliant, which is an important thing to understand. You know, it is good to understand how this all comes in, and our Fusion support group is very well suited to help everyone on XIO Cloud and in Fusion and with Fusion. So that's an important thing. I know that there's some people who are looking for a standard private cloud for the government scenarios, which could be potentially compartmentalized. That is not available for XIO. However, you know, creating their own on-premises Fusion environment in a VM cloud environment may meet those needs. So there's a lot of things as to what can be done to accommodate and support those solutions. And working with our Fusion support group, FSG at Crestron.com, we can definitely help with those solutions and designing. You know, so that's an important aspect of what you can do with security, is to work with your team, Sean and Scott, or our teams globally, as we have sales support services teams around the world. You know, and for those of you who don't know what GDPR is a general data protection regulation, which is part of the European Union. And it is a regulation that protects privacy and data. Okay, and we are compliant with GDPR. So I hope that answers that question that came in. There are XIO cloud servers located in the world. And if there is enough of a demand to stand it up in specific countries, we can make arrangements to do that. So those capabilities and possibilities are there, but the demand has to be there. You know, standing up a cloud instance for no charge it doesn't quite work, right? So there's a business justification as people are asking these questions, and keep that in mind. Okay, having said all that fun stuff, just as a reminder, NVX is a fiber solution, right?
Yeah.
So you can do that. You can have fiber switches connecting to, you know, devices like your control processors. So you can do a complete fiber isolation and an air gap solution through that fiber communications concept as well.
You can certainly isolate individual NVXs. You can also isolate the switch itself. I've seen recently when people wanted to keep a traditional DM switch, they used NVX for point-to-point fiber for distances that were too far when they wanted to be able to do 4K, for example. So they just switched out to HDMI cards and then just did a pair of NVXs point-to-point via fiber. The real benefit to NVX is the fact that that SFP port allows for different types of fiber. So you're no longer locked into a single mode as one transmitter or a multi-mode as one transmitter. You're not separate product lines now. It's just a matter of switching out the actual SFP itself to be able to support multi-mode or single mode. And I know single mode is officially the comment is single mode's rare because of the expense and the distance, but you do encounter it. I encounter it not only in military applications, I actually encounter it downtown New York is a great example because of the high rises and how far they have to go, and it's more than 1,000 feet. So in those instances, if they're in the basement and they're going all the way up to the top floor, you're looking at single mode fiber in some instances to be able to achieve that. So go for it, Scott.
We're back to our control interfaces with no cameras.
I knew it was there somewhere. I'm sorry, everyone. When we were designing the slides, I thought it was on the other slide. So this kind of, we time travel backwards. This is we're right here. It's perfect. People always forget the interface. They go through everything else. And I'm thinking of all these polling questions now that we're doing this live, but how often do you go through an entire scope of work? You lay everything out, you've got your little sketch pad, etc. You figured out where everything's at, and they didn't mention how they want to actually control all of this. They didn't say if they wanted a keypad or a touch panel. They didn't say where it was located, if it's one of them, if it's two of them. I've actually had situations, in fact, had a couple of them recently, where we did AV flow drawings and the end user very politely requested that we amend the AV flow drawing to actually put that NC for no camera at the end of the touchscreen. Even though the BOM had already reflected that, even though we'd already done all the orders and everything else, because of the individuals they were presenting to, they really wanted to make sure that it was brought home that there is no camera, no microphone on those particular panel locations. And I say panel, screen, whichever terminology you want to use. I'm old. I still say panel. Sorry. But a lot of times they'll do that. They'll want it actually properly labeled out.
So here's a little challenge of our situation that we talked in our last class about no touch. We all have, we're talking about touch panels, this and that, but what about no touch in security? That's kind of bring up something.
That's hard. That's legitimately hard. I mean, you can do AM200s, but you're connecting up with a LAN cable, so you're still plugging something in. Mm-hmm. The wireless is a significant challenge depending upon that secure environment. I'll be very honest. Nobody wants a voice control in these environments. Voice control is something that everyone is very, very skeptical of for these particular environments. So 9 times out of 10, the closest you're going to get to that I can be honest with is you're going to get something like an AM200. You're going to get something like a DGE where you can annotate stuff so that you don't have to do it on a dry erase board. You can just annotate it live on the video. We've done a lot of courtrooms where we did multiple DGEs, allowing for different locations to be able to circle things. Let's say that it's a video with evidence on it. You want the witness to circle a certain spot. The attorney's not sure if that's what they're referring to, so they draw a little arrow on it on their end, right? This is all interactive stuff that's essentially just for those specific locations, allowing you to very easily clean and sanitize after the fact. But yeah, no touch is certainly a difficult, it's a tall order, especially in a secure environment, to be very honest on that. So, yeah. And we're right back kind of to where we started. I know this kind of comes full circle. I don't mean for it to be too basic, but figuring out who actually reviews your proposal, the email chain, if you will, to try and sort through who do I need to get signed off. And I know a lot of people had made comments earlier that some subcontractors, they just want you to sign off that here's the equipment. And that's great. Here's the equipment. Here, I made it on site. But there's also the test and the adjust of the room itself. And more importantly, there's getting the green light. Does all of this meet the security requirements? And really what I should say before I put the cart in front of the horse here, a lot of times they have to sign off on the security requirements, et cetera, being met before the equipment shows up. I mean, that's the bigger conversation. They need the white papers. They need the certifications. They might even have questionnaires, and we'll get to that in a minute, but they might even have questionnaires where those white papers from engineering, those certifications that we've earned aren't everything that they're asking about. So they have follow-up questions like anyone else. As much as I say the interview process, quite frankly, you're being interviewed at the same time you're talking to them, because security is all about asking you questions, right? So when I say, do they have a security questionnaire, I think, Rich, this is probably a good spot for a poll. I'm wondering if anybody's ever had one of these, because these are fun.
Yeah, let's bring that up. So how many of you have used our SecRec at Crestron.com? And what is SecRec at Crestron.com? It is our team that helps you with security assessment questionnaires. In fact, it allows us to work with you to help provide the information. It may be specific of a questionnaire provided by a government agency, a financial agency, a hospital, healthcare, etc., education. There are a lot of questionnaires that go through this team. Some of the questionnaires we receive are simple ones. Some of them are pages and pages and pages and require a lot of research and a lot of conversations with you, with your end client, to understand their requirements as they request a lot of different information. We have a team at Crestron that takes care of this. And they're a good group. They oversee the entire security requirements. They help run the security.crestron.com information and put that all in there, which is some good stuff. But this is really some exciting resources that are available to you, our customers. And it does take a little bit of time to get it processed. Okay. Now, the great name, again, the email is, in fact, you want to advance the slide here? It's going to on the poll here, guys. The email is secreq@crestron.com. I'm gonna wrap up the poll in a moment. We have a great site called security.crestron.com. And this is a wonderful landing page to answer all these security questions.
Yep.
Okay. So, and I think you're going to cover that in a slide or two,
Yeah,
right? So I'm jumping ahead. I know.
Yeah.
I'm getting ahead of myself.
I promise.
But I'm going to end the polling here and sharing the results. It seems to me, Sean, that very few people know about the ability for us to assist in security assessment questionnaires. And so I think Mr. Pavlik's team may be getting a little bit busier once the session is over. So Mr. Pavlik, I apologize in advance of your team being somewhat inundated with additional questions. But I tell you what, Scott, can you advance the slide on this one? And let's go ahead and tell them a little bit about.
Yeah.
This is where you submit your questionnaires to. Okay. Yeah. And there's a lot of information we want you to include. Okay. And it's important because we don't want to spend tons of time going back and forth. So we're going to ask for your project name. We're going to ask for the project deadline. We're going to ask for the end user, and really most important, a list of equipment, because we can fill out a questionnaire on a very broad level, but many companies want to know the specific security items by each product. Okay. Take a look at the, sorry, thank you. So taking a look at the list of equipment is important. Now, if you are in the United States and you submit it to secreq@crestron.com, which is secreq@crestron.com, please copy your regional sales manager and your regional technical director. If you don't know who the technical director is, check with your sales manager. Your company knows who that is. If you are abroad outside of the United States and Canada, please copy your regional sales manager. Why? Because we want to make sure that your information is not being duplicated, okay, and it gets processed correctly by the team. If you go to security@crestron.com, you can see the advisories that we have. You can see how to fill out the questionnaire. All that information is there and shown for you, okay, which is a great thing. And that is an important aspect, okay? We do, so, and now the question becomes, how long does it take? All right. And it takes a little less than 10 business days. Yeah. Why? Because there's a lot of information to review. There's a lot of things to go with the teams. Okay. So it's important to understand that this is a great feature, okay, that is available for you. It's at no charge, and it helps you with your applications with your clients. Okay. Right. And it is a big security issue for many, many, many different corporations, right? So make sure that when you need this information, we're here to do all this stuff, okay? And if you go to security.crestron.com, you can find the information on how to fill it out, how we support things, our advisories that we have. We have a huge resource, and I know you're going to cover this again later on,
Hmm.
Sean. There's a whole series of resources that are in there as well. Okay. When you submit this SICREC at Crestron.com, it automatically generates a case.
Yep.
Okay. And that case will give you a confirmation email. Okay. And again, when you submit it, copy your RSM. This way we know, because otherwise they're going to generate an email as well, and it generates more work. You are going to get email conversation through the case system, through TrueBlue support. Okay. Yep. And the support team actually is really feeding it straight to the security questionnaire team to get that information shared and to get that information taken care of. Okay. Yeah. So they are there to help. They're going to coordinate with you. Please don't generate additional cases on the same instance, but reply to that email, to that case that's created on that confirmation email with additional information, follow-up questions. Stay in that track so we don't duplicate the efforts. It really is a huge help, and the team comes through a lot of information to help you on questionnaires for your financial organizations. And this, by the way, applies to the team globally, regardless of where you are, anywhere in the world, US, Canada, Europe, Australia, New Zealand, Asia, China, Sweden, wherever you'd like, SECREC is available for you. They're here to help. On top of that, we have a great set of resources at security.crestron.com. And you can see here, we have some of them shown here. These will be live links. You can go to security.crestron.com now to get that information. It is there for you. Reference guide for Fusion Cloud Services, residential systems, NVX, control systems, control system architecture, touchscreens, XIO Cloud, SSL and multi-domain certificate licenses, Air Media, IP guidelines for the IT professional. This is a great document to share with your end client. And of course, Crestron Flex UC engines. In addition to, we have other help files for audit tools, authentication, SSL management, and 8021X. This is a huge trove of resources for security in your worlds. And there's many worlds that it applies to. Take a look at this information. It is a fantastic location for resources, for information to help you. It's a lot. I'm not going to tell you, hey, it's a quick little guide and you're done. But there's fantastic things to calm the IT department, fantastic information to allow you to get in the door, to communicate in a manner in which you may not be comfortable with. Okay? So take the time, look at that information. It really is very, very, very helpful. I also recommend taking our new CNSD course, which is a design course for network for the network. And it spends a lot of time talking about these secure environments. How do you design for the secure environments? It is a day-long course. We're on a 90-minute session here, and covering everything we need to cover in a 90-minute session is not quite that easy. But it really is a wonderful set of information for you to be able to talk to your customers, to be able to do all of this with them. Okay, and this is something that actually we implemented earlier this, actually, well, I don't know, about 10 months ago. When did this go live? Do you remember?
I think it was about 10. It might have been a little bit more, but I think it was about 10
more,
months.
Maybe about a year
I remember
ago.
working with the team.
Okay.
Also, real quick, just to mention, they have the vulnerability reports on there as well. And I know IT, that's one of the bigger things IT looks for. I know earlier someone was asking about penetration testing. Any kind of results would actually be on security.crestron, any kind of vulnerability reports, etc. It's all there. All of it is there. I'm a little concerned, and the only reason I say that is because I know in the security realm, it's fairly common for them to issue questionnaires, and I'm very curious as to how people previously were answering them. I gotta say, I don't recommend answering a security questionnaire on your own because there's a multitude of information on there. It's always best to just submit that to the manufacturer, in this case us, let us comb through it. And as we're doing that, again, it takes about 2 weeks, about 10 business days. As we're combing through it, you can always have a glance here at the security.crestron. Some of the information they submitted in that questionnaire may be answered through this. And so you can always send them documentation, but in addition to that, some of the documentation in here may actually spur more questions. It may go in a direction that they hadn't really thought of, and suddenly they'll say, you know what, here's the questionnaire I gave you, here's some follow-up questions. And I have to stress, a lot of times when you run into questionnaires, I run into them not so much with military, it's usually large enterprise corporations. That's 9 times out of 10, the big corporations, they want to know who they're working with. And some of it is actually not even related to the equipment. They'll have stuff in there like HR policy, who has access to this information, et cetera. There's a lot of strange things that you can encounter sometimes on a questionnaire because, again, they want to know who they're doing business with. We've had several situations where we actually had to fill out an NDA before we were allowed to see the questions they wanted to ask us. I found that completely fascinating. We have to agree to not say anything before you ask us, but we don't even know what you're going to ask.
And a lot of sometimes they'll send in a questionnaire that's you have to have permission to get into it, and you're
Correct.
You're the only one allowed to actually use that, and they see when you're logged into it and when you're working on it. So even the questionnaires are secure sometimes.
Yes, and I had, as Scott and I were developing this class, Mr. Pavlik made his team available. Mr. Pavlik's team is the ones who do the security.crestron. It's a great group of individuals. We had a chance to sit down with them, and the fascinating thing is these are not yes or no answers. You start to answer yes or no to certain questions, and suddenly what was one question dovetails down into 7 more questions just because you said the word yes or you said the word no. And what they're responsible for, they actually track down this information. In a lot of cases, they go to the different individuals within engineering to do a deep dive on certain products to verify and vet what that information in the questionnaire is. This is an incredible resource. It does take a lot of time to properly do all this. That's why they're saying up to 10 business days. So there's a lot there. There certainly is. As far as your RSM, as far as your tech director, if you're stateside, making sure they're aware of it because they can help you keep tabs on it. Hey, what's the status? How's it looking? They can also help if you have to submit additional questionnaires. So if you have more information, they're certainly a great resource to help with, provided everything is documented under the same case number, because as Rich said, we really do not want to duplicate things. We want to try and streamline this as much as possible. We don't want any delays for you guys. We want to get you the info and get you guys going as quickly as we can. But this goes a long way to establishing a trust relationship with the IT team. It really, really does. So, all right. Scott, can you launch the drawings on yours? I'm a little afraid of my laptop.
All right, so I'm going to have to stop sharing for a minute and bring them up. You want to go through some Q&As while I'm changing this up?
Yeah, I'm fine with that. Rich, you got any Q&As lined up for us?
The ones that are left in the Q&A need a little bit of research, so we're
Okay.
double checking some things. So, you know, just going back to the concept here, again, this is a design course. It's not designed for the programmers, right? This course is intended to understand how to establish the secure design principles and the information you need to design for it. Okay, so that's a really important aspect in understanding the intention of this particular course and what it's geared for. Now what we're going to do is we're going to start talking about designs that can be used in secure environments and what and how that can be implemented, correct? Gentlemen, so
Yep.
let's take a look at this, Sean. I'm going to turn over to you and Scott to talk about this. I believe you wanted to zoom in and talk in depth a little bit about this particular design and how it could be utilized in a multifaceted, secure environment. And I'd like you to reiterate, you're going to discuss things called SIPR and NIPR and all these wonderful acronyms. If you'd be so kind as go through those acronyms, what they mean, okay? And also talk about fiber isolation and how those typically are used, right? And keeping in mind, you know, that there are different technologies from Crestron, some that are fiber solutions, some that are, you know, copper solutions, and how each of them can play into the requirements.
Absolutely. So this particular design, again, all of the designs that we're going to be showing you guys are designs that we worked on our own to develop, as well as with various entities to develop. All of the entities information has been completely removed from any of these designs, but these are great examples that I really just kind of wanted to show you guys. Unfortunately, my laptop ran into what I will politely call technical issues. I've had to reboot it twice. So for those reasons, Scott is the one that's going to be actually sharing his screen on these. Scott, can you zoom in left side where the AV3 and TSW are real quick for me? Just a little bit. All right. You'll notice where it's the system control, it actually said ×2 up there. And the reason for that is that they actually wanted redundancy. So it's the system control ×2. In reality, they are doing two separate touchscreens. Scroll down slightly. So there are two 1060s in here. This is the whole ×2 thing. There's also two AV3s. The 1060s, this actually was the one that they wrote back very politely saying, can you please add that NC on the tail end of it? And you'll notice as Scott kind of hovers over that 1060 NC, these are actually active links. He could, in theory, click on that and launch a web browser that'll take him right to that product. It's a very interactive in that respect. These blocks were done by our CAD team, so our CAD team did all these drawings. But they did two 1060 no cameras and two AV3s. They wanted a redundant backup. The two N60s would be active at all times. The AV3s would toggle back and forth. If one went down, they wanted to bring the other one up, and they were writing all kinds of great custom code for that. Now, in my mind, I'm trying to remember exactly what I can and can't say, so apologies if you see me thinking a little bit here. They actually requested to have a multi-classification room. These are actually all for what I will refer to as analyst locations or analyst stations. So you'll notice it says, for example, SIPR, it says, for example, NIPR. It also says, for example, coalition, right? And in all aspects of SIPR, NIPR, and coalition, what these are is these are separate classifications, separate sources, separate, if you will, networks. The sources that are on those particular networks, SIPR, for example, is a secure network. NIPR is an unsecure network. Coalition, in this case, was a network they established just for their coalition partners with appropriate information. In all cases, these were actually for 3 separate racks. Those PCs were not at the desk. All you had at your desk was a keyboard, a mouse, and a couple of monitors. If you were of appropriate clearance, you had the NIPR and the SIPR. If you were a coalition partner, you may have, for example, the NIPR and the coalition. It all depended upon how they wanted to lay it out, but they really wanted to go ahead and zoom in a little bit, Scott, on the 6 for me real quick. They really wanted to ensure that you had access. Anything could theoretically go to anything if they wanted it to. And the key word is if, because the individual in charge of dictating where everything went was going to be doing that off the 10-inch panel. They could actually, for whichever shift it was, this is all computers, but for whichever analyst shift it was, they usually had, I think you said 20 or 25 at a time. He could say, these are going to go here, these are going to go there, these are going to go there. They would have the appropriate information for them to work on for that point in time. Their keyboard, mouse, etc., that was all, you'll notice on the right side where it says workstation monitor times X, that's where they had their keyboard mouse locations. That's where they were able to actually plug in, but they weren't physically in contact with the direct media itself. The media was isolated in particular racks. Rich, to your conversation that you were asking about with the fiber isolators, we did individual switches for each one of those 3 on the left. For SIPR, NIPR, and coalition, they each had their own labeled switch. It was a fairly large Cisco catalyst in each case, and we just simply put fiber isolators on the uplinks. So you kill the uplink, you kill communication to the switch, it's not going in or out, and that source essentially dies if you need to. Scott, scroll down towards the bottom. There's one more that I want to show you guys. Nope, sorry, that was the wrong one. Back real quick. There we go. Scroll down towards the bottom and zoom in on the very last, it's the 4th one down there, the very last section, if you could zoom in on that for them. Yep. Just do a zoom and we'll do it. So do a zoom and then we'll scroll down, because I do want to show this. You'll notice Yeah, just go down slightly. There's zipper, there's nipper. And get down to the bottom of it real quick. Coalition, that's pretty standard. That's great. Here's the part I want. A little bit more. There we go. You'll notice it says additional sources times 19. If you remember my conversation earlier about a sales rep that asked a question they shouldn't have, that's what they were asking it in relation to. I make a point, especially on presentations, to not tell any kind of a story unless it has a direct relation. This is that direct relation. Those additional sources are considered of higher clearance. They are very specific as to what they will and will not release those sources to. And for that reason, we could not do any kind of labeling. You'll notice we actually literally said HDMI source on the flag that's coming into it. That's all they would tell me. That's all I needed to know. I did ask for clarification if it was HDMI 1.4 or HDMI 2, just so I knew from a resolution standpoint what we could and could not support. And I did send them a list of resolutions supported by NVX and let them decide what information they would like to tell me. Because in all honesty, I did not need to know. I just needed to make sure that it could work with our system. Go ahead, Scott. You could jump to the next.
So there's a lot of questions coming in about drawings. Gang,
Okay.
I just posted in the question and answer section. There is actually a link on our website that has CAD drawings available for our product. So I sent that out to in the question and answers. Okay. But these particular drawings, Sean, we're going to be able to put these in as part of the presentation. At the end, we'll send them out to everybody so they will have those as well.
I noticed the concerns about encrypting and not seeing things in plain text, etc. And I'm right there with you for a lot of this stuff. These drawings have been approved to be sample drawings. They are not at live installations. The designs that I did for live installations have additional measures in place, so there's no concern from a security standpoint on this. These are for sample reasons is what these are. These are early development drawings in a lot of cases. All right?
And sometimes we make these drawings up just for examples of just stuff that we've done. You know, they're not actual live drawings that we've done for customers.
Right.
Modified them to make sure that, you know, we've put a little more Crestron things in, you know, so these drawings are really just for examples only, just to show what you kind of consider and look at.
And then, guys, if you could, we got a lot of questions on what are the fiber isolators. So could you reiterate what are fiber isolators, how it's a separate device? It's not a Crestron product.
Correct.
Okay. But could you explain that a little bit more in depth? Okay. Yeah. And how that would come into play?
So a lot of times what you have, and I'm trying to think of the name of the company, I'll have to reach out and get you the actual company name because there's a couple of them that are approved. But what they have is they're almost, how do I word this? They're very similar to when you see things like gate relays, for example, where you have a input contact on the box. That input contact on the box is just looking for a closed connection on the other side. So you wire the input contact to a relay on, for example, an AV3. We close the relay on the AV3, it closes the contact on this. That in turn then goes ahead and shuts down fiber entirely and isolates that particular spot. Now I've seen them go a couple different ways. I've seen them where it's looking for a closed contact. I've also seen it where it's looking for an open contact. So I've seen both styles. I think there's a little dip switch on some of them that can do that as well. What they really do is they have two fiber ports on them. One fiber port that's specifically labeled as your incoming, your second fiber port that's then going to come out and go into your actual physical switch. Train of thought, that comes out and goes into your network, not into your switch, into your network. So I'm coming from switch into fiber isolator, out of fiber isolator onto network. And I could do it that way. I could do it the other way as well. At the end of the day, what I'm really doing is when I push a button that says I don't want this particular switch to communicate, it actually breaks the connection. It essentially decouples the fibers right there. So you're not actually communicating whatsoever on that. The technology itself and the manufacturer, that's not made by Crestron. That is entirely third party. It's just something that I've seen a lot of, especially a lot of DoD applications that have adopted it. Now, in some instances, they'll go a step further and they won't isolate the switch. They'll buy these boxes and they will isolate individual one-on-one NVX devices themselves. And then you can also see situations where they do power management as well. So they do a little bit of everything. There's a whole ton of stuff on here that people have done essentially to make that environment as secure as they can. So, Rich, any other thoughts or questions on that, or pretty well covered? Or
no, I think we seem to be answering the questions. Why don't we continue on, because we're getting close to the wrap-up time.
That's what I was afraid of. That's why I was trying to kind of show this a little bit. This one here, we had a couple of laptops on a table. We again have the no camera, but here's where things get interesting. They had a single, when I say no camera on the touchscreen, they had a single camera in the room, but they had two different codecs. One codec was for one security level, one codec was for the other security level. And the complication they ran into, and this happens a lot, is if I have one set of displays, one set of cameras, but multiple sources, how do I achieve that without breaking things? Because if I were to put these all on separate networks, IT would have to tunnel. That becomes a huge risk. I'm not allowed to actually cross-pollinate networks. So the end result was we developed this as its own entire multicast subnet. And by doing it that way, we're just distributing the video. And I actually had to get on the phone with the IT security team for this conversation, specifically to explain that no, we were not touching any of their networks. We are strictly distribution only. And at that point, they made an air gap network. They didn't even subnet it. They made an air gap network, bought their own switches. I don't remember if these were Extreme or Cisco or what, but I remember they bought their own switching hardware because they asked me for the answer ID, which is 1000314. That's the one that has all the switching stuff on it. My specialty, gentlemen, is military and NVX. So that's why the class kind of went that direction. Anyhow, bottom line, what we had to do is we had to mount a camera up on a wall. Scott, go ahead and zoom in. But by mounting a camera on the wall, for anybody who's seen NVXs, they're a big box that are meant to go behind a display. They're not meant to go behind a little camera that's an HDMI camera. So to achieve that, I actually did an HD EXT3, but that presented another problem. That HD EXT3 is copper between the transmitter and the receiver. And in this conversation, I had to ensure that it was not a fiber-only room. I have run into rooms that are restricted to fiber only. So that was a question I had, and I had to justify it with, there's a camera on the wall, we want to extend HDMI, you can do that third party with, because the resolution they were using, you could do that third party with fiber, or I can do this with this product here, which is the HD EXT3. They agreed that copper only is fine. They later decided to do just copper for a lot of their infrastructure because it was air gapped. So that worked out perfect. At the end of this, they started value engineering things because that's the conversation no one has. Everybody always loves security. Security is not cheap. Security is incredibly expensive. And the more expensive the products become, the more they're looking at how can I value engineer certain things. So we actually settled on an E30 to be able to broadcast the camera, specifically because of the fact that the camera itself was just going to show video. It wasn't going to show any audio. We did have a conversation about the displays. So if you want to go to the right where the displays are, they wanted to have video walls. And because they did video walls, we did the 350s. But at the time, I did notify them via email, if they made the decision to go to just standard displays, they could bump down to a D30 provided they were handling all the resolutions. So as long as their display is doing the scaling, you could drop to a D30, save a little bit of money, and be able to do it that way as well. The last one here, which is really just the last one I have, is actually the exact same design, but they wanted to do it with a much larger video wall. They actually wanted to do it with a 12 video wall, as they called it. 6x2, I believe, is what it was on their video wall specs for that one. So that was their other request was, can we do it with this kind of a video wall? And the part that I laughed about is because, and I'm not going to do a side-by-side, but if you were to have looked at the last one versus this one, all we did was add a couple extra NVX devices. So at the end of the day, when we were planning all of this out, we were able to prove to them with a series of drawings that anytime you want to add an additional source, anytime you want to add additional display, you have to have the appropriate network drops, and then you just pop in another box and you're ready to rock and roll. That very first one that I showed that had Sipper, Nipper, and Coalition, that was all 350s. You don't have to go back to it, don't worry. That was all 350s, and that was by design, because if they had stations that went out and they had equipment that needed to be critical, they could always grab one of the 350s that was not in use, jump into the web browser, give the proper information to it, and then set it at a station that was deemed critical. So we gave them that backup ability, and that was key for them. They wanted everything redundant, everything ready to rock and roll. The minute they realized how quickly they could roll out 350s, they were happy. We got our sales rep to get them, I want to say it was 5 or 6 350s as a sample to see how they operate and to put them on a test bench. And they ended up ordering quite a few of them, to say the absolute least. They were very, very excited to be able to utilize those. So this is all a lot of different designs. Apologies in advance if we went the military route, because the military tends to be one of the more secure ones. And again, that is my specialty. But yeah, this is definitely a fun conversation to have, Rich. I think we're right at the hour and a half, by the way. I talk fast, and I think we're still there.
We're right at the end of the wrap up. So Scott, if you could bring up the last couple of slides here so we can wrap this up, and then we will move over to answering some of the questions that are in there, which is some good stuff. There's a question that came in: was there an NVX controller box? How was it integrated? I think one of your drawings, Sean, was
Which box?
An NVX controller box, control processor.
Okay.
Did you have a control processor in the drawing, I think is what they're asking, and how was it integrated?
Well, the control processors have to be in the drawing because the NVXs themselves are essentially just boxes. You could, in theory, control them with like something as small as an RMC3 all the way up to an AV3. It's a 3 series of some sort, essentially. Scott, I think, oh, there you go. You're back, Scott. Okay. So you can control them with any number of 3 series controllers, but there has to be a controller there somewhere. If I could follow up, Rich, were they asking about Director though, or were they asking about just a 3 series controller? Because they're
just
two
asking
separate
about, it looked like
things.
a 3 series controller. So there's a separate question: is did the NVX Director get offered as part of these solutions?
It depended upon which solution it was. In the event of the redundancy one, we made the decision not to run with Director because of the capabilities they were specifically asking for and the amount of custom code. In some of the other installations, in fact, the second and third drawing, those both had a Director 160 in them. That was to facilitate quick switching and control within the room. So it really depended upon what the application was. I make the same comment that when selecting product, you have to be aware of what the capabilities of the product are and what people are actually asking for to be able to do as well. I'm seeing a couple of chats come up in regards to signage, and that's something that also comes up quite a bit, is you have to notify the participants in the room when you're changing classifications. Sometimes they notify externally and internally. Sometimes the room is a secure locked location. It's just internal that they're notifying. But there's almost always signage located somewhere. A lot of times it's third-party digital signage. Sometimes it's an LCD with specific color combinations and a DGE 100. I've done that a few times actually when they wanted to do it that way. It really depends on the job site as to how they're handling that. So.
Great. All right. So why don't we go ahead and wrap this up here, Sean, and then we can wrap up the call, but we can remain after for some Q&As.
I'm sorry, I went over. Scott, you got the rest of it. It's tech sales, man. Go for it.
So yeah, everything that you we were discussing just now, you can always give us a call to talk about that. You can always submit your stuff to techsales@crestron.com. We can work with you on your designs, going through all this stuff. If you need help on phone calls with clients as well, we're always available for that too, to help out with the IT stuff, answer some of those questions. We also have Job Havlic's group, which is going to do all of your stuff for the SecRec questionnaires and things. So if you haven't used us before, you know, our services are free. And we've give you some useful links here. This is our splash page, sales support services. Depending on where you are in the world, it's going to bring up our contact information up here. This is for US here, but if you're in Belgium, it's going to bring up your Belgium contact, UK, things like that. There's some cool, this is our web portal service. Then we have a whole design center on the back end. There's application drawings where you could find some of these drawings. We also have a whole full CAD library that you could download for your AutoCAD. And we also have image blocks that you can download if you're doing Visio work. And so, Sean, you want to finish up?
Well, really, I'm still laughing at the photo here, Rich. I love that photo. It just makes me smile every time I look at it. Really what I kind of wanted to do is just from a reflection standpoint, for all of you, this class may be validation for certain practices you already have in place, certain things that you're already currently doing. It may be validation, hey, I'm doing the right thing, or hey, this has worked for me and other people are kind of doing the same thing. A lot of times in a security environment, we operate in a bit of a bubble. We can't really talk about what we're doing. We can't really say anything to other people. So sometimes you wonder, hey, is there a better way to do it, or am I doing it the right way? At the same time, I'm hoping even those of you that do this as a day-to-day, this is everything you always do, that you were still able to glean a couple things out of the class, not just validation, but just a couple of things that you might not have thought about. I think security.crestron is probably the biggest thing out of this class, because it sounds like a lot of people were not aware that we were there. And then the third comment, which is kind of the comment I leave everyone with, is how are you going to adapt as things change? Security, honestly, is a cat and mouse game. Every time you make something more secure, somebody else comes along and figures out a way to break it. And then you have to make it more secure, and so on and so forth. So at the end of the day, you know, how are you going to take this knowledge, both the experience you have and the knowledge you may have gotten from this class, and adapt that to future designs? I really do appreciate the opportunity to present to you. I know Scott and I both were very excited about this. Rich, certainly thank you. Mr. Pavlik, thank you as well, as the two of you gave us access to be able to put this together. And really, it's been a privilege to be able to be a part of this team. So certainly thank you guys.
Great. Thank you, Sean. Thank you, Scott. Thank you, John. Great to have you. Our next class is tomorrow, and it is at the same time, 11 a.m. Eastern. It is MTA-205, a space utilization class, and we're going to talk about digital signage, scheduling, and a lot of capabilities there. A couple of quick things, Sean, before I wrap up. There's a question on what was the number of the info document for switches?
1000314.
1000314, or 1,314,000. Fantastic.
Yep.
Okay.
That should have the minimum network requirements. It'll also have all of the switches that engineering has currently tested, as well as firmwares and configurations that are, it's all sample firmwares and configurations. I don't recommend running that in a live environment. I've had 2 IT guys that have called me because they made that mistake. You never want to load it live. You just want to open it and look at it, because it's designed specifically for testing NVXs. But yes, 1000314.
Fantastic. Thank you, Sean. All right, I'm going to go ahead and wrap up the call. Thank you, those who've joined us. If you want to hang out and have some conversations with us as kind of like an after class, after party, you're welcome to do so, but I'm going to stop our recording here. Thank you all for attending. Thank you for those of us who've joined us. We look forward to seeing you again tomorrow. We really greatly appreciate your time.
Take care, everybody.